If you want to stay here after Christmas, you'll need to pay rent." The words rang out across the dinner table, in front of more than 20 people, like a knife driven straight into my chest. I stood there, my hands still smeared with turkey gravy, my ears ringing from the strained, awkward laughter around the table. Not a single pair of eyes looked at me with support. I looked at my son, the one sitting confidently in the seat of the so-called homeowner. And for the first time in my life, I understood something terrifying. My silence had nurtured his ingratitude. I stayed still and said nothing. Not because I was weak, but because in that very moment I decided to leave that house and take with me a truth that could make my son lose everything. If you're still listening, tell me where you're watching from. Every comment you leave is another mark in this journey. And if this story has touched you, don't forget to hit like so it can reach even further. The smell of roasted turkey still hung in the air, mixed with cinnamon from the apple pie and the pine scent of the Christmas tree brushing the living room ceiling. I had been awake since 5 a.m. that morning, as I was every year preparing Christmas dinner for the family. Not because anyone asked me to, but because I had grown used to working quietly behind the scenes, making everything perfect so others could enjoy the holiday. My name is Helen Whitmore. I am 66 years old, a widow, and judging by the way everyone in that room looked at me that night, I was nothing more than an elderly mother living off her son. The long dining table was covered with a crisp white tablecloth. The Christmas china I had carefully kept for over 20 years was neatly arranged. Crystal glasses shimmered under the warm yellow lights. More than 20 people, relatives near and far, my son's friends, my daughter-in-law's co-workers, were gathered around the table. Laughter and polite holiday chatter filled the room. I moved between the kitchen and the dining room like a familiar shadow, refilling California wine glasses, clearing dirty plates, placing more bread on the table. My apron was dotted with gravy stains, my wrinkled hands trembling slightly as I carried heavy serving trays. No one noticed, and I didn't expect them to. Andrew, my son, sat at the head of the table. His suit was perfectly tailored, an expensive watch peeking out from under his cuff. He spoke animatedly about new projects, important meetings, plans for the coming year. His voice carried the confidence of someone who believed everything he had was the rightful result of his own efforts. Vanessa, his wife, sat beside him in a striking red dress, her hair carefully styled as if for a photo shoot. Each time Andrew finished a sentence, she smiled and nodded, smoothly adding a few comments that made the story sound even more impressive. She casually wove in remarks about city living expenses, about how maintaining this lifestyle isn't easy, as if they were harmless observations. I heard the names of upscale restaurants, weekend getaways, utility bills, property taxes, maintenance costs, all spoken in the tone of people carrying the weight of the world on their shoulders. And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, the conversation shifted to rent. Andrew leaned back in his chair, took a sip of wine, and scanned the table before his gaze landed on me. My heart tightened, not with anger, but recognition. I had seen that look before. It was the look his father, Thomas, wore whenever he made a major decision. The difference was that in Andrew, the look was colder, more self-satisfied. "Speaking of expenses," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "we should clear up a few things, for fairness." The room seemed to pause for a beat. I stood there, still holding the serving spoon, not yet able to put it down. "If Mom wants to stay here after Christmas," Andrew continued, his tone casually cruel, "she'll need to pay rent. like any other adult, or maybe she should find somewhere more appropriate. No one laughed, but no one objected either. A few people looked down at their plates. Others cleared their throats, pretending to be busy with their wine glasses. Vanessa took a small sip of her wine, the corner of her mouth lifting in the faintest smile, as if everything were unfolding exactly as it should. I felt every beat of my heart in my chest, not from embarrassment, not entirely from pain, but from a hollow sensation spreading inside me, the feeling of someone realizing she had been standing in the wrong place for far too long. I looked around the table. More than 20 faces. People who had eaten the food I cooked, sitting in the house I still called home. Not one pair of eyes stood with me, and in that moment a truth I had avoided for years became painfully clear. I had made it easy for them to treat me this way. I was used to stepping back, used to saying, "It's fine," used to letting my son believe he was carrying me, that I needed him, that my presence in this house was a favor he granted. I had been silent for too long, and that silence had been interpreted as weakness. I placed the spoon down on the tray. The soft clink of metal against porcelain sounded quiet, but in my mind it felt like a full stop. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. Not because I wasn't hurt, but because I knew that anything I said then would only turn me into a beggar in my own story. I smiled, the polite smile I had practiced my entire life, and excused myself from the table, saying I needed a moment to rest. No one stopped me. No one asked if I was okay. As I walked toward the hallway leading to the bedroom, I heard the party slowly resume behind me. Someone mentioned dessert. Someone turned the Christmas music up a little louder, as if to sweep away the discomfort that had briefly passed through the room. The bedroom door closed behind me, and for the first time that night, I allowed myself to stand still, not to cry, but to think about all the years I had lived this way, about the choices I had made, and about how, if I continued to stay silent, tonight's words would not be the lowest point, only the beginning. I looked at the old suitcase in the corner, lightly coated in dust. I looked at the locked document case hidden deep in the dresser drawer, something no one in this house knew about. And in that absolute silence, I understood that my next silence would no longer be endurance. It would be the beginning. I closed the bedroom door very gently, as if afraid of disturbing someone, a habit I only then realized was meaningless. Outside, the Christmas music grew a little louder. Laughter returned, hesitant at first, then steady again, as if the moment that had just happened had never existed. I leaned against the door, closed my eyes for a few seconds, and took a deep breath. The room was strangely quiet. The only sound was the steady ticking of the wall clock. One Andrew had once said was vintage but didn't fit the apartment style. I walked slowly inside and turned on the small bedside lamp. Its soft yellow light revealed the room I had lived in for the past 3 years, the room I still called mine, though officially it had never truly been. A neatly made single bed, a small wardrobe, a vanity table with a mirror chipped at one corner. Everything was simple, orderly, just like the way I tried to exist in this house, taking up no space, causing no inconvenience, never making anyone feel I was a burden. I sat on the edge of the bed and rested my hands on my knees. They trembled slightly, not from cold, but from a feeling both familiar and new rising in my chest. It wasn't exactly sadness, not quite anger. It was a painful clarity, the moment when someone finally sees her true place in the eyes of those around her. In this house, I was no longer Andrew's mother. I was Andrew's mother in the sense of an outdated responsibility, an older woman living there because of circumstances, because of family, because it's just how it's always been. Someone others could speak to the way they had tonight without considering the consequences. I remembered the looks on a few guests' faces when Andrew said those words. No outrage, no sympathy, just an uncomfortable understanding, the kind of look people give someone who should know better, as if I truly were living off them, and the suggestion was simply a reasonable adjustment. I let out a silent, humorless smile. If only they knew. But I stopped that thought, not out of fear, but because I was beginning to understand that for many years I had allowed that image to exist. I had built it myself, bit by bit, with my silence, my nods, my "it's fine" reassurances that I thought were sacrifices, but were really acts of erasing myself. I remembered the times Andrew introduced me to his friends. This is my mom. She lives with us. Nothing more. No mention of what I had done, what I had given up. And I never corrected him. I let my son feel proud in his role as the devoted son, the family provider. I thought it was good for him. Dinners like tonight weren't the first time I had felt invisible. I was used to sitting at the table and getting up early to clean, used to hearing Andrew talk about our house without ever correcting it to your house. Used to Vanessa joking that I was too frugal, laughing as if it were just a harmless quirk of an old woman. I had yielded so much, all so my son wouldn't feel inferior to anyone. I let Andrew believe he was taking care of me, that I needed his protection. I thought it would make him stronger. I didn't realize that when someone is always placed in the role of the giver, they can easily forget to respect the one receiving. My silence, in the end, had been misunderstood. It wasn't seen as calm or loving. It was seen as acceptance. And from that acceptance, boundaries disappeared. I stood up and walked to the small wooden dresser against the wall. Opening the bottom drawer, I pulled out a dark brown leather document case. It had been there a long time, long enough for the leather to wear thin at the corners, long enough that I almost forgot how heavy it felt in my hands. I placed it on the table and unlocked it. Inside were neatly organized papers, contracts, certificates, numbers printed clearly, cold and precise, things Andrew had never seen, and I had deliberately kept it that way. I turned the pages, not to reread them, but to remind myself I was not the helpless woman they thought I was. I had never been anyone's burden. I had lived a long life, working, calculating, enduring, building. I just never told that story to the right audience. My fingers paused on a familiar page. I exhaled softly, feeling a knot in my chest loosen. It was time, not to prove anything, not to take revenge, but to end a role I had played for far too long. I glanced at the clock. Almost 12 a.m. Outside, it was Christmas, a night people talk about family, love, forgiveness. I reached for my phone, opened my contacts, and stopped on a familiar name, Leonard Brooks. Leonard answered after the second ring. His voice was calm and steady, as always. "Helen, is everything all right? I didn't expect a call at this hour." "I'm sorry to call so late," I said, keeping my voice even, "but I need to talk to you, now." There was a brief pause on the other end. Leonard didn't ask questions. "I'm listening." I didn't ramble. I didn't complain. I said only what needed to be said. Short, clear sentences. I told him I needed him to prepare a few things, that changes were coming, that I didn't want to wait any longer. Leonard sighed softly as if he had been waiting for this day. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I've never been more sure," I replied. When I hung up, a strange sense of relief settled over me. Not the relief of someone dropping a burden, but the feeling of someone finally straightening her back after years of bending. I opened the closet and pulled out a small suitcase. It wasn't big. I had never needed much. I packed a few simple outfits, the clothes I actually wore, my familiar flats, a warm coat for winter. Nothing extra. I paused in front of the mirror. The woman looking back at me had gray streaks in her hair, deep lines around her eyes. But in that gaze, I saw something I had lost long ago: clarity. I no longer felt like I needed permission to exist. Outside, the laughter continued. I knew what they would think when they saw me rolling out a suitcase. They would assume I was being dramatic, that I'd be back in a few hours, or the next morning, gentle as always, apologizing for making things tense. But not this time. I zipped the suitcase closed. The sound was clean and final. I grabbed the handle and stepped out of the room. When the door shut behind me, I didn't look back. A roll had ended. I pulled the suitcase into the hallway, but instead of heading straight for the door, I stopped in the quiet space. Christmas lights cast faint reflections on the walls, trembling in time with the music drifting from the dining room. In that moment, a very old memory rose up, quietly, gently, like an underground river that had flowed through my entire life. Thomas Whitmore. Just thinking his name made my chest tighten, not from pain, but from a deep, steady longing, the kind that doesn't knock you down but never fully leaves. I met Thomas when I was 22 in a small town in northern New Jersey. Back then, I worked part-time as a bookkeeper for a building supply store. The job wasn't glamorous. Logging entries, checking invoices, counting small numbers. Thomas was a construction worker for the same store. Tall, broad-shouldered, his hands always dusted with cement. He spoke little, smiled gently, and looked at things with a focus that made it seem like every wall and every plot of land held potential. Others hadn't noticed yet. We didn't fall in love all at once. Everything happened slowly. Conversations after work, sitting on the warehouse steps, sharing a cheap cup of coffee. Moments when Thomas asked if I was sure the numbers were right, and I smiled and said numbers don't lie. We married in a simple ceremony with only family and a few close friends. No extravagant dress, no lavish reception. But I remember that day clearly. The feeling that I had chosen the right person to walk through the hardest years with. And hard years there were. In the early years of our marriage, we lived in an apartment so small that if we stood in the kitchen together, we had to turn our backs to each other. Thomas worked from early morning until late at night. I worked 2 jobs, days at the store, nights doing bookkeeping for small local businesses. Some months, the money in our account barely covered rent and basic groceries. We didn't travel. We didn't eat out. Every decision was carefully weighed, but we never complained. Thomas used to say, "As long as we know where the money's going, we'll be okay." And that's exactly how we lived. He built with his hands, and I made sure nothing slipped out of control. When Andrew was born, life became even harder. I remember sleepless nights, rocking the baby with one arm while checking ledgers at the small dining table with the other. Thomas would come home in his work clothes, sit beside me, exhausted but with bright eyes. We didn't have much, but we had each other. And we had one clear belief: the future doesn't come from luck, it comes from persistence. The first house we bought wasn't a home in the romantic sense. It was old, cracked walls, a leaking roof, in a neighborhood people shook their heads at when driving by. But Thomas looked at it like an unfinished blueprint. He said, "It has good bones, it just needs work." We bought it with all our savings, plus a loan I had to calculate down to every dollar of interest. Thomas fixed it up with his own hands every weekend. I handled the paperwork, pulled permits, negotiated material prices. Andrew was still little back then, often sitting on the floor playing with scrap pieces of wood, giggling every time Thomas handed him an old nail. When that house sold for more than we expected, I still remember the feeling of holding the check in my hand, not because of the money, but because it confirmed that what we were doing was right. We didn't spend that money. We used it to buy the second one, then the third. Every time, Thomas saw potential where others only saw risk, and I made sure we never crossed the line. I tracked every expense, every contract, every smallest number. No decision was made without passing through my hands. Whitmore Holdings was born not as some grand dream, but as a necessary step. A lawyer advised us to form a company to manage the assets better. Thomas named it simply, after our last name. No flourish, no show. From the outside, we looked like any other middle-class couple. I still drove an old car. Thomas still wore work clothes. Andrew grew up in a home that wasn't overflowing, but was steady, and that was intentional. I remember clearly the conversation Thomas and I had late one night after Andrew had fallen sound asleep. Thomas said he didn't want our son growing up feeling like the world owed him something. He wanted Andrew to understand the value of work, of effort. I agreed. We decided that the less we talked about assets, the better. Not because we were ashamed, but because we believed there were things that should only be seen once a person was mature enough to understand them. Then Thomas died suddenly. It was a cold, rainy morning. He was checking on a job site when he collapsed. The heart attack came fast and gave no one a chance to prepare. When I got to the hospital, he was no longer awake. I held his hand, felt the warmth slowly leaving, and in that moment, my world felt like it stopped. After the funeral, everything turned quiet in a terrifying way. Andrew was still young then, trying to act strong, but I saw fear in his eyes. I didn't allow myself to fall apart, not because I didn't hurt, but because if I went down, there would be no one left standing. I took over Whitmore Holdings in silence. No press conference, no announcement. Leonard Brooks, the man who had worked with us from the beginning, became my right hand. I sat in the small office in the back and kept doing what I had always done, making sure everything ran smoothly. Andrew only knew that everything was fine, and I let him believe that. I kept living simply. I didn't change my lifestyle. I didn't show off. I let my son believe I needed him, that he was carrying me. Part of me thought that would help him grow up, but I didn't foresee the cost of hiding the truth for so long. Standing in the hallway tonight, the suitcase by my feet, I realized all those years no one ever saw, had led me to this moment. Not to blame anyone, but to understand that some sacrifices, if placed in the wrong spot, turn into erasure. I bent down and gripped the suitcase handle tightly. I wasn't carrying the past to accuse anyone. I was carrying it as a truth that was finally ready to be acknowledged. And this time, I wouldn't hide it anymore. I stood still for a few more seconds in the hallway, then pulled the suitcase forward. The wheels rolled softly over the wood floor, making a small but distinct sound. That sound pulled me back to another chapter of my life, one where things began to tilt off course, very slowly, very quietly, so much so that by the time I noticed, it was already too late. Andrew graduated from college during a spring with a lot of rain. I still remember his graduation day. I sat in the stands, my hand clenched around my old purse, watching Andrew in his cap and gown with a heart full of pride and worry at the same time. My son was smart and hard-working, but the job market back then wasn't easy. His first job was at a small architecture firm, and the pay was enough to live on, but only enough in the bare minimum sense. Andrew wanted more than that. I could see it in his eyes when he talked about luxury apartments, livable neighborhoods, classmates who had already moved to a bigger city. I understood that ambition. I had once felt it too. And because I understood, I made a decision whose consequences I wouldn't fully see until much later. I told Andrew that my company had an empty apartment, not an ordinary one. An apartment with space, in an area where the market rent was higher than Andrew's monthly paycheck. I said it was an internal discount that I could help him rent it for much less. Andrew refused at first, saying it wasn't fair. I laughed and said that sometimes life needs a good start. I lied, not completely, but enough that he didn't ask more questions. I didn't tell him the apartment belonged to Whitmore Holdings. I didn't tell him the rent I offered was only a small fraction of the real price. I only told him it was a temporary opportunity to help him get settled. Andrew moved into that apartment with a pride he didn't bother to hide. I remember the first time I walked in. He spun around once, laughed out loud, and said he was finally living the way his hard work deserved. I stood beside him, smiling, saying nothing. I was used to saying nothing. After a while, Andrew asked about a car. Architecture work required meeting clients, going to job sites, moving around a lot. Andrew's old car wasn't suitable anymore. I thought about it for a long time, then told Leonard to arrange for Andrew to use a car registered under the company. Just temporarily, I said, just for work convenience. Andrew didn't read the paperwork carefully. He only saw the new car, the way people looked at him differently when he parked in front of the office. I saw that and I let it happen. I thought that if he felt more confident, he would go farther. Then came the credit card. Andrew told me there were emergencies sometimes, unexpected expenses, things he needed to pay up front before getting reimbursed. I opened my drawer, took out a secondary card linked to my account, and handed it to him. "Only use it when you need to," I said. "Don't abuse it." Andrew nodded very seriously. I believed him. At first, everything was just as I expected. Small, reasonable charges, a business meal, a few necessary things for the apartment. I reviewed the statements each month and saw it was still under control, and I stayed silent. Then Vanessa appeared. Vanessa came into Andrew's life like a strong wind, confident, bright, always sure of what she wanted. The first time I met her, Vanessa wore a bold dress, talked fast, her eyes always searching for attention. She complimented Andrew's apartment, complimented the car, complimented my son's taste. Andrew stood beside her, wearing a smile I rarely saw before, the smile of someone who felt he had achieved something worth admiring. Vanessa brought a different world with her, a world of expensive restaurant dinners, weekend trips, things I had never considered necessary. Andrew changed quickly. He started talking more about image, about status, about how he had to look the part in other people's eyes. I saw that change, but I didn't intervene. I told myself it was just a phase, that once Andrew was stable enough, he would adjust on his own. I used to believe that with enough love and patience, everything would balance itself out. The bills started getting thicker. I was still the one receiving the statements. I was still the one seeing every number. Charges for high-end restaurants, stores I had never set foot in, trips I wasn't told about beforehand. I sat at my desk, the lamp casting light onto the white pages, my hand resting on the keyboard, my chest heavy. I could have spoken. I could have stopped it, but I didn't. Every time I considered bringing it up, Andrew would talk about a new project, a new opportunity. Every time I saw the excitement in his eyes, I would think, a little more won't hurt. Vanessa always had a way of making it sound reasonable. Investing in image, building relationships. You can't be cheap in this industry. And I stayed silent. That silence wasn't blindness. I saw it clearly, but I chose to step aside, as if as long as I didn't say anything, it would stop on its own. I underestimated the power of privileges handed out with no boundaries attached. Andrew slowly came to believe everything he had was because he deserved it, that the apartment was a reward for effort, that the car was proof of status, that the credit card was just a convenient tool, nothing more. And Vanessa never stopped reinforcing that belief. She talked about the life Andrew deserved, about how you can't live like an ordinary person if you want to succeed. Those words seeped into my son's thinking, little by little, until they became truth in his mind. And I kept playing the role of the simple, frugal mother who asked for nothing. I let Andrew believe he was taking care of me. I let him take pride in that role. I didn't realize that when someone believes they're the one giving, it becomes very easy for them to forget gratitude. Mistakes didn't arrive all at once. They accumulated, like small drops of water falling steadily, unnoticed, until one day the glass overflowed. Tonight, at that Christmas dinner table, the glass overflowed, and I, at last, stopped trying to keep it from spilling. I left the house while the party was still going on behind me. Laughter, clinking glasses, familiar Christmas music carried on as if nothing had happened. The door closed behind me softly, but inside me, it felt like a clear final period on a role I had played for years. The car took me to the small apartment on the west side of the city, where I stayed whenever I needed quiet. On Christmas night, the streets were emptier than usual. Decorative lights reflected off the wet pavement, stretching into long, blurry streaks. I looked out the window and my chest no longer felt hollow the way it had at the dinner table. Instead, there was a cold, lucid awareness. As if, after years, I was finally seeing everything with my own eyes. When I stepped into the apartment, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I set my bag down and stood in the darkness for a few seconds. The familiar scent of old wood, books, a space no one could intrude on made me breathe deeper. Here, I could be myself. Not the mother living off someone, not a shadow behind my son's success. I turned on the table lamp, opened my phone, and called Naomi Feldman. Naomi answered after the second ring. Her voice was low and steady, carrying the clarity of someone used to late, unannounced calls. I didn't need to explain much. I just said I needed to see her right away, tonight. Naomi paused briefly and replied, "I'm at the office, come." Naomi's office was in an older building with soft yellow lighting and a quiet so deep I could hear footsteps in the hallway. When I walked in, Naomi was already seated behind her desk, a file open in front of her. She looked at me, not with suspicion, just waiting. I told her about the Christmas dinner. No embellishment, no complaints, just what happened. Each sentence, each silence. Naomi listened, her hands folded together. When I finished, she nodded slightly. "We'll do this cleanly," Naomi said. "No emotion, just legal." I nodded. That was exactly what I wanted. Naomi pulled the first file closer. The lease. The apartment Andrew was living in. She turned the pages, her finger stopping at a small but clear clause. The lease had a term, conditions for non-renewal, and the right to end it under the law with proper notice. "Everything is legal," Naomi said. Nothing vague. I looked at the familiar lines and remembered the day I signed that lease. Andrew had signed quickly, without reading carefully. Back then, I hadn't said a word, and now I didn't need to explain. Naomi moved to the second file. The car documents, the company name, temporary use, no personal ownership clause. Everything was so clear it couldn't be argued. I can take it back right away, I said. Naomi nodded. Yes, and there's no legal basis to fight it. The third file was the credit card. Statements spread across pages, numbers following numbers. Naomi didn't comment. She simply placed her finger on the total at the bottom of the page. I looked at that number and felt no anger, only exhaustion. Not because of the money, but because for so long I had used my silence to legitimize a life my son hadn't earned. Naomi looked up at me. You know what you're doing, right? I do, I said. And this time, I truly did. For a very brief moment, my heart tightened. The thought of Andrew, the child I once held in my arms, the nights I stayed awake when he had a fever, flickered through me. But then I remembered his eyes at the table, the way he spoke about rent, the way he looked at me as if I were an obvious burden. I took a deep breath. I don't want to do this halfway. Naomi raised her eyebrows slightly, but she wasn't surprised. Then we'll do it decisively? We reviewed everything, step by step, the order of notices, deadlines, the process of repossession. Nothing personal, nothing meant to punish, just restoring boundaries I should have set long ago. As Naomi printed the final documents, I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a few seconds. The inner struggle wasn't loud the way I once imagined. It felt like a slow, steady wave, carrying me toward a decision I could not reverse. That night, I understood something with painful clarity. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's leniency disguised as sacrifice. And that leniency had made Andrew believe everything he had was automatic. When Naomi handed me the papers to sign, my hand didn't shake. My name appeared on the page, clear, firm. Not the signature of an angry mother, but of a woman deciding to take responsibility for her own mistake. When I left the law office, dawn was close. The city was still quiet. I drove slowly back to the apartment. Once inside, I made a cup of hot tea and sat by the window. The first light of the new day began to slip through the blinds. For the first time in a long time, I felt I wasn't being pulled in two directions. I wasn't torn between being a mother and being myself. Everything had fallen into its proper place. I turned off the light and went to bed. That night, even though it was short, I slept peacefully. No dreams, no jolting awake, just the deep sleep of someone who had accepted the truth and stopped running from it. The next morning, I woke up before it was fully light. The apartment was so quiet I could hear the heater clicking softly, the steady drip of water in the sink. I made coffee and stood by the window, looking down at a street where only a few people were out early walking their dogs. Everything looked normal, too normal compared to what I knew was beginning on the other side of the city. My phone vibrated lightly on the kitchen table. A text from Naomi, very short. The notice has been sent, email and hard copy, everything on schedule. I read it and set my phone down. There was no feeling of victory, no regret, only a deep stillness, as if I had just closed a door that had been left open too long. Somewhere, Andrew was opening his email inbox. I can picture the scene clearly even though I'm not there. Andrew has a habit of checking his email in the morning, right after sitting down at the table, his coffee cup still steaming. My son usually scrolls quickly, skipping advertisements and unimportant notifications, but that subject line wouldn't be skipped. Notice of non-renewal of lease agreement. Andrew would open it, read the first line, then the second. I know he would have to read it at least 2 or 3 times to make sure he wasn't misunderstanding. That apartment in Andrew's mind was home. It was an achievement, proof that he had accomplished something in life. But an email has no emotions. It only talks about clauses, deadlines, the date the apartment must be handed back, clear, cold, no room for negotiation. And then would come the second blow. Andrew would keep reading, then call the management office, his voice tight, trying to stay calm. He would ask why, say he had always paid on time, never caused trouble. And on the other end of the line, another professional voice would repeat that this was the landlord's legal right, and that if Andrew wanted to continue renting, he could submit a new application at the current market rate. The real rent. I can imagine that moment very clearly. The instant he hears the number, the calculation racing through his mind so fast it almost hurts. Andrew's income, the fixed expenses, the familiar bills, none of it would line up anymore. There would be no way to make it work. The third blow would come faster than I expected. Vanessa would be the first to discover it. I picture Vanessa in a store, bright lights overhead, the familiar scent of perfume, her hand holding the card she was used to swiping without thinking. Vanessa isn't someone who checks balances. She's used to everything being approved. And then the card reader would make a short, dry sound, declined. At first, it would be a mistake. Vanessa would force a smile and ask them to try again. Then again. The cashier's expression would shift slightly, from polite to cautious. People waiting in line behind her would start to look. Vanessa would leave the store with her face flushed, her hand gripping her phone tightly. The call to Andrew would be impatient, blunt, just panic mixed with anger. My card doesn't work. What's going on? Andrew would open his banking app, see the notification that the secondary card had been locked. No warning, no explanation, just a simple cold line of text. And then, as if that weren't enough, the next blow would come the same day, the car. Andrew would head down to the parking garage, keys in hand, his mind still tangled up in the email and Vanessa's call. He would slow when he saw the familiar, empty space. That parking spot, the one where the car was always parked, would now be vacant. At first, he would think he was mistaken. He'd walk a few more steps, look left, look right. But no, the car wouldn't be there. I can see Andrew standing frozen for a few seconds, his heart racing, cold sweat breaking out despite the winter air. Then he would call the garage, his voice starting to lose control. And on the other end, someone would explain briefly that the vehicle had been repossessed at the legal request of the owner. Everything would collapse at once. Panic would come last, but it would be the strongest. Andrew would call me. I know that. He would call again and again. When I didn't answer, he would text. At first, confusion, then anger. What did you do? Have you lost your mind? I wouldn't reply, not because I wanted to run away, but because some lessons cannot be taught over the phone. Andrew would start blaming. He would say I went too far, that I humiliated him, that I destroyed the life he had built. He wouldn't mention his words at the Christmas dinner. He wouldn't bring up paying rent. In his panic, he would only see his own loss. And then, for the first time in his life, Andrew would feel what it means to be empty-handed. No home, no car, no emergency savings, no safety net. I know that feeling. I lived it when I was young. But for Andrew, it would arrive suddenly, like being pushed off a height with no time to prepare. after the first wave of anger would come doubt. Andrew would start asking questions. How could everything be taken back so easily? Why did the contract allow it? Why wasn't the car actually his? Why was the credit card in my name? He would begin to re-examine details he had never paid attention to before. Documents he signed without reading, vague answers I had given him, the times I avoided his questions when he pressed too hard. And then Andrew would start digging. My son isn't foolish. Once the shell of confidence is stripped away, what remains is a mind capable of analysis. Andrew would go back through old emails, old contracts. He would search for information about Whitmore Holdings, a name he had heard me mention in passing but never considered important. Every search result would be a small shock. The company, the assets, the connections, familiar names appearing in places Andrew never expected, and the pieces would begin to fall into place. I know that somewhere in that process, Andrew would stop. He would sit for a long time, staring at the screen, his mind blank. Not angry, but filled with another feeling, the realization that for years he may have been living inside a story that wasn't entirely true. One shock would follow another, quietly, without drama, not like in the movies, but deep and impossible to avoid. As for me, I sat in my quiet apartment, my hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold. I wasn't happy, but I wasn't in as much pain as I thought I would be either. I was simply waiting. Not waiting for an apology, not waiting for remorse. I was waiting for the moment my son would begin to see the world through his own eyes, not through the privileges he once believed were natural. The days that followed passed slowly, as if time itself was cautious of what was about to be uncovered. I didn't actively check on what Andrew was doing, but I knew he couldn't stay still. Some falls force a person to stare at the ground for a long time before lifting their head again, and Andrew was right in the middle of that moment. The truth began to surface from a single name: Whitmore Holdings. That name had once been nothing more than a vague phrase to Andrew, something that appeared occasionally in my passing comments or on envelopes he never opened. But now Andrew typed it into the search bar with a different mindset, not idle curiosity, but an anxiety he couldn't shake. I imagine Andrew sitting in front of his computer screen, the blue glow reflecting on a face hollowed out by several sleepless nights. The results weren't loud, no sensational headlines, no shocking news, just corporate records, dry but precise information, year of formation, areas of operation, asset portfolios. And then my name appeared, not as someone's mother, not as a footnote, but right there in the center, clear, undeniable. My name listed as the principal shareholder, legal representative, the person signing documents Andrew had signed beneath, as a tenant, a user, someone who had been favored. I know that moment would be silent, no shouting, no slamming fists, just a sudden void opening up in my son's mind where old beliefs collapsed all at once. The apartment, the car, the credit card. None of them were rewards for effort anymore, but things placed in his hands deliberately and taken back just as easily. Andrew would push his chair back, stand up, pace around the bare room. He would remember every time I said, "It's fine." Every time I refused to buy something new for myself, every meal I cooked in silence. Pieces that once seemed disconnected would suddenly lock together in a way that made it hard to breathe. But Andrew still wouldn't fully understand. Not yet. So he would go to the only person left who could tell the whole story without evasion. Aunt Ruth. Ruth is Thomas's sister, almost 10 years older than me. She lives in the suburbs in a small, aging house with a yard always neatly trimmed. Ruth witnessed nearly my entire adult life, from the early years of hardship to the moment I chose to step back. I can imagine Andrew standing at her door, his hands awkward in his coat pockets, exhaustion and fear in his eyes. Ruth would open the door, see him, and sigh softly. She wouldn't be surprised. Perhaps she'd been waiting for this day for a long time. They would sit across from each other in the small living room, hot tea steaming. Ruth wouldn't circle around the topic. She would look straight at Andrew and say, "You're here to ask about your mother, aren't you?" Andrew would nod. For the first time in days, my son wouldn't try to appear strong. His voice would go hoarse as he asked why everything was this way, why I lived so simply, almost invisibly, while behind me stood an entire structure he had never known about. Ruth wouldn't answer right away. She would look out the window where bare branches swayed lightly in the winter wind. Then she would begin to tell the story, without embellishment, without dramatizing it. She would talk about me when I was young, about the years I worked without rest, about how I managed every dollar, every expense, while Thomas laid brick by brick, about the nights I sat at the kitchen table with ledgers while Andrew slept in the next room. Ruth would talk about my decision after Thomas died, about choosing not to change my lifestyle, about wanting Andrew to grow up as an ordinary person, to understand the value of work and independence, about my deepest fear, that if my son knew he was standing on too thick a cushion, he would never learn how to stand on his own. Andrew would sit silently, no arguments, no interruptions. What Ruth said wouldn't sound like an accusation. It would sound like a calm account of choices I had carried alone. When Ruth finished, the room would fall quiet. Andrew would lower his head. For the first time, he would look at himself not through the lens of success, but through the consequences of arrogance. He would remember the Christmas dinner, the way he spoke about rent as if it were obvious, the look in my eyes then, not angry, just quiet. Andrew would begin to understand that my silence wasn't weakness, but a choice. Meanwhile, Vanessa wouldn't accept the truth so easily. When Andrew told her what he had discovered, Vanessa's reaction wasn't shock, it was outrage. She didn't see the lesson, she only saw the loss. Vanessa would say I had deceived them, that I was selfish, that I had staged an entire performance to control my son's life. She would speak loudly, quickly, as if volume alone could change reality. Andrew would try to explain, try to say that maybe he had been wrong, but Vanessa wouldn't listen. To her, this truth meant losing the image she had built, an image of a glamorous life admired by others. Arguments would grow more frequent, no longer small disagreements, but direct confrontations. Vanessa would accuse Andrew of lacking backbone. Andrew would accuse Vanessa of only caring about money. Words would be thrown without restraint. And then, in the rare quiet moments between arguments, Andrew would begin to unravel. Not because he lost the apartment, not because he lost the car, but because he lost the story he had been telling himself. The story that he had built everything on his own, that he stood where he stood because he deserved it. When that story collapsed, Andrew no longer knew who he was without it. My son would begin to replay every action, every word. He would remember how he treated me, not cruelly but without respect. He would remember his blind confidence at the head of the Christmas table, speaking about financial responsibility as if I were an outsider. Regret wouldn't arrive like a storm. It would come slowly, heavy and persistent. It would make it hard to sleep, hard to finish a meal. It would make Andrew feel ashamed for the first time in his life, not before others, but before himself. As for me, I wasn't there to witness it, but I knew. because some changes don't need to be seen to be felt. They spread through silence, through unanswered questions, through a person finally repositioning themselves in the world, and that was only the beginning of awakening. In the days that followed, Andrew fell out of his familiar orbit faster than I had ever imagined. No longer in a spacious apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a busy street, he moved into a place he would never have paused at before. An aging building tucked between modest storefronts, narrow and dark stairwells, the smell of dampness mixed with cheap laundry detergent. The elevator often broke down, so Andrew had to climb to the 4th floor, each step creaking as if reminding him this wasn't a short visit. His new apartment was so small that morning light had to squeeze through a single window, slanting across a stained wall. There was almost no furniture, just an old bed, a chipped wooden table, and a plastic chair faded with age. Andrew stood in the empty room, took a long breath, then set his suitcase down. He didn't say it out loud, but in that moment, he knew. This was the bottom. Vanessa didn't come with him. Her departure was swift and cold, just like her arrival in Andrew's life. No tears, no hesitation, only firm words about how she couldn't live like this, about a life she hadn't signed up to endure. Vanessa packed her things, leaving the room behind with a sharp slam of the door. Andrew stood still, his hand gripping the back of the chair, watching her leave without managing to say a single word. For the first time, my son was truly alone. In the days that followed, Andrew began doing something he had never had to do before: count every dollar. He sat at the small table, a blank sheet of paper laid out, a pen placed neatly beside it, and started writing numbers down: rent, utilities, food, transportation. Expenses that once seemed trivial suddenly turned heavy. He discovered that even one meal out could throw off the entire week's plan. Andrew learned how to cook simple meals over and over again: fried eggs, boiled pasta, canned soup. He stood in front of the stove listening to the oil crackle, his hands clumsy but with no other choice. Every time he poured food onto a plate, Andrew thought about dinners from before: brightly lit restaurants, crisp white tablecloths, wine glasses shimmering. The comparison brought no comfort, only a tightness in his throat. Money wasn't enough. Andrew started looking for extra work, not glamorous jobs or ones he once thought were worthy of him, but late shifts, manual labor, work he had once walked past without noticing. He worked at a small store, stocking shelves, wiping them down. On nights, he came home late, his back aching and legs heavy with exhaustion. Andrew lay on his bed staring at the low ceiling and thinking about earlier days, when he walked out of an office in a tailored suit, believing he had reached some position in life. Shame came slowly, but it lingered. Andrew avoided meeting old friends. He didn't want to explain, didn't want to answer polite questions about how things were going. He feared the searching looks, the long silences after he mentioned his new place. Some evenings, he sat alone in the small room, the sound of traffic outside drifting in endlessly, and realized that loneliness wasn't as loud as people imagined. It simply sat there, covering everything. He compared his current life to his old one, not to mourn it, but to understand it. Every object he once used, every convenience he took for granted, now carried a clear price. Andrew began to understand that work wasn't just a title printed on a business card, but every hour on his feet, every minute spent laboring, every dollar exchanged for effort. Some nights he wondered who he had become over the years, not the person he thought he was, and not the person he wanted to be. He remembered talking about success in front of others, remembered the certainty in his voice when speaking about financial responsibility, remembered the Christmas dinner, where he had placed me below numbers. Questions began to surface, impossible to push aside. Andrew questioned his own worth, what he had truly accomplished, which parts of his life came from effort and which came from support he had never acknowledged. One night after midnight, Andrew sat at the small table, his phone placed in front of him. The screen lit up with my name and his contacts. He hesitated for a long time. Words appeared, then were deleted. He didn't know how to begin. Apologize for what first? For his words at the dinner? For years of arrogance? Or for failing to see me as an independent person? In the end, Andrew typed a short message. No embellishment, no excuses, just a rough, awkward but sincere apology. He said he had been wrong, that he was learning how to live again from the beginning, that if possible, he hoped to talk to me, not to ask for help, but to ask to listen. The message was sent. Andrew set the phone down, his heart beating faster than usual. He waited. A few minutes passed, then 10. No reply. Andrew watched the screen fade to dark. That silence wasn't like before. It wasn't defiant and it wasn't punishment. It felt like an empty space that needed time to be filled. My son sat there, his back against the chair, accepting for the first time that some things couldn't be repaired immediately. As for me, I read the message very late. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't hear it, but because I understood that sometimes silence is the only lesson left to teach. I set the phone down, looked out the window at the distant city lights, and knew my son was walking a necessary road, one no mother could walk for him, and I let him walk it. Time passed slowly, but it didn't stop. After the first weeks of struggling with his new life, Andrew gradually realized that simply enduring wasn't enough. He needed a different anchor, not money, not status, but a reason to wake up each morning without feeling ashamed of himself. The first job Andrew took after the collapse was unlike anything he had done before. It was a temporary position at a small construction company that specialized in renovating older homes in working-class neighborhoods. The pay was low, so low that when Andrew read the number in the confirmation email, he let out a dry laugh. But he accepted it. There were no glass offices, no personal desks, no business cards with titles. Andrew wore old jeans, safety boots, a hard hat, and stood on job sites filled with dust and the claying of metal. On his first morning, he arrived earlier than scheduled, standing awkwardly among workers who had known each other for years. No one cared where he used to live or what kind of car he drove. Here, people only cared whether he could do the work. Andrew started with the simplest tasks: carrying materials, cleaning up, measuring. Some days his hands blistered from tools. His back hurt so badly that at night he only wanted to lie still. But strangely, that exhaustion carried none of the emptiness he felt before. Each evening, washing his hands in cold water, looking at small cuts on his skin, Andrew knew he had done something real, even if it was small. Gradually, he began to understand his father's profession in a way he never had before. Andrew remembered Thomas Whitmore coming home with dusty clothes, sun-darkened hands, the smell of wood and cement clinging to his jacket. Back then, Andrew was young and only thought his father worked hard. Now, standing on job sites himself, Andrew understood what that hardship meant, how small decisions could affect others' safety, how a single mismeasured millimeter could lead to serious consequences. Some afternoons, Andrew sat eating lunch with the other workers on concrete steps. Simple meals, bread, hot soup, inexpensive fruit, The men and women around him talked about their lives openly without pretense or display. Some supported entire families in cramped apartments. Some worked 2 or 3 jobs just to cover rent. Andrew listened, first awkwardly, then thoughtfully. For the first time, he saw people who had far less than he did, less money, fewer choices, but no less dignity. They worked hard, laughed when they could, complained when necessary, but didn't see themselves as victims. Andrew realized he had been living inside a bubble, where worries were about image and status, not about tomorrow's meal. Andrew's life gradually shrank. No more impulse purchases, no more frequent dining out. He learned to live with what he truly needed: a small room to sleep, a meal that filled him, a job tiring enough that he could sleep deeply at night. That simplicity didn't make him feel deprived. On the contrary, it made him feel lighter. And within that simplicity, something else began to form: self-respect. Not the kind tied to other people's opinions, but the feeling of standing on his own 2 feet. Andrew no longer needed to prove anything every time he left the house. He knew what he was doing, why he was doing it, and how far he could go if he kept going. The idea took shape one rainy afternoon. Andrew was standing, looking at an old house being renovated, peeling walls, a leaking roof, yet still capable of becoming a decent place to live if redesigned thoughtfully. He realized that many problems weren't about lack of space, but about how space was used. Small apartments could become brighter and more functional if designed differently. The thought didn't leave Andrew's mind. That evening, after finishing a simple meal, he sat at the table and took out paper and pen. Not drawings for clients, not assigned projects, just rough sketches, room layouts, ways to use light, ways to reduce material costs while keeping safety intact. Andrew worked until he lost track of time. Some nights he looked up to find dawn approaching, drawings piled up on the table, numbers scribbled in the margins. He began to imagine a model for affordable housing, not temporary, not patchwork, but dignified living spaces for people who had never had better options. He thought of the people he met on job sites, families living packed together, children studying under dim lights. Andrew didn't think about profit first. He thought about feasibility, about how a house could be built at the lowest cost while still being sturdy, bright, and warm. When exhaustion set in, Andrew thought of me. Not to blame, not to ask, but to understand. He began to see more clearly the path I had walked, the patience, the discipline, the unglamorous but steady decisions. Andrew realized that what he was doing now closely resembled what Thomas Whitmore once did, and what I had quietly built. The new person within Andrew didn't appear suddenly. It didn't arrive with a brilliant moment of awakening. It grew slowly, day by day, in sweat, repetition, and small but consistent choices. Andrew was no longer a man who believed he deserved everything good simply because he wanted it. He began to understand that value isn't given, it's created. And somewhere far away, I felt that change without anyone telling me. There are bonds between mother and son that don't need words to be recognized. I knew Andrew was being reborn, not into a more perfect version, but into a truer one. And for the first time in a very long while, I believed my son was on the right path. Life has its own way of bringing people back to familiar places, but with an entirely different mindset. Andrew received an email inviting him to present his project late one evening, just after finishing a long shift at the job site. The subject line was brief, unadorned, but enough to make him sit still for several seconds in front of the screen. An investment group was looking for low-cost, sustainable housing ideas, and someone had passed along Andrew's sketches. He read the email again and again, not because he didn't understand it, but because he was afraid he did. The invitation promised nothing. No mention of budget, no talk of partnership, just a presentation. But to Andrew, that was more than enough. The meeting day arrived faster than he expected. That morning, Andrew stood in front of the mirror in his small apartment, adjusting a carefully ironed shirt. He didn't have many clothing options, no expensive suit, no shiny watch, just clean, neat, sufficient clothes. When he left, Andrew carried a thick folder, not only drawings, but notes, numbers, and lived experience. The location of the meeting stunned him the moment he stepped off the bus. A tall building, glass reflecting the pale gray morning sky. Andrew stood at the entrance, gripping his bag strap, his heart beating faster. He had passed this place before, but never like this. Back then, he entered as someone favored, believing every door opening was natural. Now he entered with the caution of someone who knew he had to earn every step. Andrew gave his name at the reception desk. The receptionist smiled politely and directed him upstairs. The elevator ride felt slow, or perhaps Andrew simply felt it that way. Each passing floor matched a stronger heartbeat. When the meeting room door opened, Andrew stepped inside and froze. I was seated at the head of the table, not as his mother, not with the familiar eyes of family dinners. I wore simple but polished attire, my hair neatly tied back, a folder in front of me identical to everyone else's. My gaze was forward, showing no personal emotion. Andrew felt the air in the room thicken. He looked at me, then around. Serious, unfamiliar faces waiting. No one looked surprised. No one introduced me as someone's mother. In this room, I was a member of the panel. Andrew swallowed. In that moment, he understood clearly. This wasn't a meeting arranged out of family ties. If he stood here, there was only one reason. His project had been considered serious enough to hear. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I simply opened the folder in front of me like everyone else. Andrew was invited to begin. His voice was slightly hoarse at first, then quickly steadied. He didn't talk about lofty terminology. He didn't boast about academic achievements. Andrew spoke about old houses he had repaired, about families he had met, about how living in a small room had changed the way he saw space. He talked about how every square foot had to be calculated to be both economical and humane. The drawings were projected, not perfect, but real. Numbers were explained through lived experience, material costs, construction time, scalability. Andrew didn't avoid difficulties. He spoke plainly about limits, risks, and what could go wrong without careful oversight. The panel began asking questions. Some asked about financial feasibility, some about legal issues. Some doubted whether such a model could scale. Andrew answered each one without defensiveness or argument. When he wasn't sure, he said he needed more data. When challenged, he described what he had seen firsthand. I sat there, listening. Not as a mother waiting for her son to get it right, but as someone who had reviewed hundreds of projects and heard hundreds of presentations. And I could clearly see the difference. Andrew wasn't trying to impress. He was simply telling his truth. The exchange lasted longer than expected. When the final question ended, the room fell into a brief silence. Andrew stood still, both hands resting lightly on the edge of the table, waiting. No hope, no disappointment, just acceptance. Finally, the chair spoke. The decision was made, neither rushed nor delayed. The panel agreed to move forward one step further, not a full approval of the project, but a pilot phase, a small site, a limited budget, a clear timeline, and with it came conditions. Andrew would be directly responsible. No privileges, no personal interference. All reports had to be transparent. Every decision had to be explained. If it failed, the project would stop. I looked at Andrew for the first time since he'd entered the room. My expression didn't soften, but it wasn't cold either. It was simply direct. Andrew nodded. He didn't say thank you. He wasn't emotional. In his eyes was a very clear understanding. This was not a favor. This was an opportunity, and opportunities must be paid for with responsibility. When the meeting ended, everyone stood up and gathered their papers. Andrew remained there for a few seconds, as if he needed extra time to believe that what had just happened was real. Then he turned and walked out of the conference room without looking back. I watched his back disappear, not calling out, not stopping him. Not because I was indifferent, but because I knew this moment didn't need words. That fateful meeting didn't heal everything immediately. It didn't erase old wounds. But it placed Andrew in the right position, not under my shadow and not on a false pedestal, but where he stood on his own 2 feet. The project began quietly, nothing like Andrew had once imagined. There was no grand groundbreaking ceremony, no stirring speeches, just a small plot of land, a few old buildings marked for renovation, a modest group of workers, and a packed schedule of tasks to complete. Andrew stepped into the role of project lead with intense focus, as if a single moment of distraction could cause everything to slip away. My son worked harder than at any other time in his life. He arrived at the site early in the morning and left late at night. Andrew no longer stood on the sidelines, holding drawings like an observer. He was in the middle of everything, resolving disputes between builders and suppliers, checking every small detail, learning how to balance progress with safety. Some days he returned to his small apartment covered in dust, completely exhausted, but his eyes were no longer empty as before. The first mistake came sooner than Andrew had hoped. A batch of materials was ordered with the wrong specifications. Not a major error, but enough to slow progress and increase costs. When the report came in, he sat silently in front of the screen, rereading the discrepancies several times. In the past, mistakes like this were often handled with a phone call, an extra payment that required no explanation. Not now. Andrew had to face the consequences directly. He called a team meeting, didn't avoid responsibility, didn't blame anyone. Andrew admitted the mistake, presented a corrective plan, and proposed cuts in other areas to compensate. Some objected, some were concerned. But Andrew listened patiently, adjusted, and persuaded with logic and transparency. For the first time, my son understood what real crisis management meant, not with money, but with credibility. I followed everything from a distance. I didn't call to check in. I didn't send advice. I read the regular reports like any other board member. The numbers were no longer abstract. They carried sweat, hesitation, and nights Andrew stayed awake trying to find balance. I saw the change in his writing. Shorter, clearer, less showy. There were moments when I wanted to intervene, when I saw progress slow, when I knew Andrew was under intense pressure. But I didn't. Not because I was cold, but because I understood. If I stepped in now, everything would lose its meaning. Maturity cannot be borrowed. The project gradually moved toward completion in quiet persistence. The finished homes weren't flashy, but they were bright and solid. Natural light was used to the fullest. The spaces were small but thoughtfully arranged. Every detail was considered. Nothing excessive, nothing missing. When the first doors opened, Andrew stepped back, watching families enter cautiously, then slowly relax. A young mother held her child, eyes filling with tears, as she looked at the small but clean kitchen. A middle-aged man stood for a long time at the doorway, his hand resting on the new wooden frame, as if making sure it was real. Andrew said nothing. He simply stood there and felt it. That was the moment my son truly understood the meaning of his work. Not the approval of drawings, not the passing of a budget, but the creation of a place, a stable footing for people who had never had one. Andrew realized that in previous years he had chased the image of success, not its value. After the final handover, Andrew didn't celebrate. He came home earlier than usual, sat in his small room and opened the window to let the breeze in. For the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to stop. A few days later, Andrew called me. Not to report, not to seek praise, just to invite me to dinner. Simple. No restaurant, no special occasion, just a meal at his small apartment. I agreed. That evening, I stepped into a space Andrew had once been ashamed to think about. The room was still small, the furnishings still minimal, but there was a pleasant sense of order. Andrew cooked. Nothing elaborate. A simple stew, bread, boiled vegetables. The smell of food gently filled the room, bringing back memories of long-ago dinners when he was still a child. We sat across from each other. Neither of us rushed to speak. Andrew looked at me for a long time before he spoke. His voice wasn't shaking, but it was slow. He didn't ask for help. He didn't offer long explanations. Andrew apologized, not for one specific event, but for an entire period of time. He apologized for taking my sacrifices for granted, for saying things he shouldn't have said, for failing to see me as an independent person. I listened without interrupting. When Andrew finished, the room fell silent again. But this time, the silence wasn't heavy. It felt like a necessary pause after a long journey. I didn't respond with a lecture. I simply said I had been waiting for this day, not to receive an apology, but to see my son stand firmly on his own. I said that maturity always has a price, and Andrew had paid it with his own effort, without borrowing from anyone. Andrew lowered his head, not in shame, but in relief. Dinner ended simply. No grand promises, no distant plans, just two people sitting together, sharing a meal, like those who had passed through pain and learned to see each other with different eyes. And in that moment, I knew my son had truly grown up, not because of success, but because he understood its cost. Many years have passed since that Christmas season, the one when a seemingly careless sentence forced all of us to stop and look directly at ourselves. Time doesn't erase memories, but it softens their sharpest edges, so that when we look back, we can see the entire road we've traveled, not just one painful turn. The affordable housing project Andrew once presented at that fateful meeting didn't stop at the initial pilot site. It grew slowly, step by steady step, much like my son's growth. Not every proposal was approved, not every phase went smoothly, but Andrew was no longer afraid of failure as he once had been. He understood that failure isn't the collapse of an image, but part of building something lasting. I saw Andrew in new roles, not through boasting, but through concise reports, meetings where he listened more than he spoke. My son learned to ask questions before drawing conclusions, to take responsibility when mistakes occurred, and most importantly, to see people before numbers. As the project expanded into other areas, Andrew proactively proposed more transparent partnership models. prioritizing quality of life over speed. There were simple home handover ceremonies where he stood quietly to the side, letting the families receiving keys stand at the center. I once believed success needed to be seen. Now I understand that lasting success often chooses silence. I changed too. Not because I became weaker, but because I no longer needed to stand on the front line. I stepped back from daily operational decisions, allowing younger people, including Andrew, to carry the weight. I chose slower mornings, reading by the window, tending to the small garden behind my house. I still followed things, still read reports, but I didn't intervene unless asked. That wasn't letting go. It was trust. That Christmas arrived with a very different feeling. No extravagant table, no conversations about money, just a warm meal, a few relatives, soft lights, and familiar music. Andrew stood up during dinner, not to announce something grand, but to say something that had needed to be said for a long time. He spoke about his mistakes. No excuses, no detours. He said he had once confused entitlement with value, support with inevitability. Andrew said it in front of everyone, not to receive praise, but to close an old chapter with dignity. When someone mentioned making it up to me, Andrew turned and looked at me, waiting. I shook my head. I said I didn't need money. I never had. What I wanted most had arrived long ago, to see my son stand upright, leaning on no one, neither puffed up with arrogance nor bowed down by shame. Character, I said, matters more than any asset that can be passed on. Andrew stayed silent, but I knew he understood. Later, sitting alone after the gathering, watching Christmas lights reflect on the glass, I thought about the road behind us, about choices that seemed harsh, about silences that were misunderstood, about boundaries. Something I learned too late, but thankfully not too late. Love without boundaries is not love. It is avoidance disguised as sacrifice. I once believed that giving without asking would protect my child, but in the end, what truly protected him was having the courage to say enough at the right time. If there is any legacy I leave behind, it isn't houses or companies. It's the lesson that everyone must walk on their own 2 feet, and that true love always comes with respect, for others and for oneself. I don't regret it. Not because everything ended well, but because I dared to face the truth while it could still be corrected. And I know that somewhere out there are people standing before choices very much like the ones I once faced, staying silent to keep the peace or speaking up to protect something more important. If this story touched you, I would truly love to know where you're listening from. A small city, a quiet town, or a familiar room somewhere. Please leave a few lines below to share. Have you ever had to set boundaries with someone you love? If you see yourself in this story, don't hesitate to tap like, subscribe, and stay with me for the stories ahead. Thank you for your time, your listening, and for sharing your heart with this journey. Your presence means more than you think.